Welcome to the final YU Library Book Talk for 2024. My name is David Hess. We're delighted to present Professor Jeffrey Gurock, who will discuss with Professor David Shatz his book, Marty Glickman, The Life of an American Jewish Sports Legend. Now, my wife, Shulamis, is the coordinator of the YU Book Talk series. So why am I, her husband, hosting this book talk? Here's why. My wife has no connection or memory of Marty Glickman. But I grew up with Marty Glickman as a fall Sunday afternoon fixture in my home, courtesy of WNEW radio. Until the mid-1970s, I believe, there was no local telecast of New York Giants home football games. The only Giants games you could see on your home television were road games. So Marty Glickman was my eyes, and particularly my ears, to the New York Giants games. Every Sunday afternoon in the fall, my radio would be turned to WNEW, and Marty Glickman was the guy who did the play-by-play of Giants games for at least a decade. And I was an avid Giants fan in my teenage years, which sadly I still am. One particular game I remember took place on Sunday Erev Sukkot. Now remember that, it was Sunday Erev Sukkot. The Giants had been behind all game, as usual in those days, and not much has changed, and somehow had come from behind to steal the game in the final minutes. The crowd at Yankee Stadium, which was the venue for the Giants games at that time, was going crazy. And Marty, although always trying to sound professional and fair during his broadcasts, was obviously a Giants fan, like most of the fans in the ballpark. Now, remember, it was Sunday Erev Sukkot. So in his enthusiasm, after this rare but special Giants last-minute win, Marty exclaimed, "It's gonna be a good Yom Tov." Probably millions didn't know what he was talking about, but thousands did, like me. I will now turn this over to Dr. Shatz.
It's hard for me to read Jeff's book without hearing Marty Glickman's voice in my head, first with the Giants and the Jets, and the book talks about him as a basketball announcer too. But let me tell you first something about Jeffrey Gurock, and this will actually lead up to a question. Jeff is a truly eminent scholar of American Jewish history. He's had a stellar career. By that I mean something like 24 books, a zillion articles, various book prizes, a medal, distinguished chairmanships, distinguished lectureships, and there was an issue of the journal American Jewish History, which was devoted to the work of Jeffrey Gurock. So there's a lot there. As I say, a very, very eminent scholar, and he's also run the marathon 12 times. Jeff and I got together on this because we're both sports fanatics. As you can see from his running a marathon, as a participant, I like to call myself a keen observer. I don't really do much of the sports itself. But Jeff, all this leads me to two questions. Question number one is, to put it in Hebrew, Ma inyan Shemitah Eitzel Har Sinai, meaning what does one thing have to do with the other? What does sports have to do with American Jewish history? This is not the first book that you've written in which you've connected them, and I think it would be very good for the audience to understand what it is that you're doing in the work. The other question is, there was a field of people from whom you could have picked. For all of the jokes about the Jewish sports heroes being the thinnest book that there is, the fact of the matter is there were other Jewish personalities around. And what led you to the choice of Marty?
Well, thank you,
Already
David.
on a first name basis, Marty. Yeah.
Thank you for that warm introduction. Now, Dr. Shatz and I also share an affinity for both scholarship and sports, and I have to note one particular moment. It was October 2003. We were sitting in Yankee Stadium, and we watched Aaron friggin' Boone hit a home run to propel the Yankees into the World Series, to the great chagrin of my dear friend, your brother-in-law, David Berger, who's a great Mets fan. Why do I write about sports? You know, I'm a man on a mission, and the mission is to elevate sports as a subject for serious contemplation and scholarship by people in my field. You know, most people, when they think of Jews in sports, they think of these encyclopedias which do their best to chronicle every possible person who may be Jewish who played sports. That's not what I'm interested in. I'm interested in using sports as a metaphor for understanding American Jewish history. And I have to say, things like how Jews dress, how Jews eat, how Jews dance, and how Jews play is an important way of understanding how they deal with adjusting to America. People talk about intergenerational conflict between parents and kids, and I write about the metaphor of the gymnasium of the settlement house as a place where kids develop interest in sports, and they come home and they have problems with their parents who are greenhorns. These are important themes in American Jewish history. But more importantly, the issue of Jews in sports is not really whether Jews win or lose or become champions, rather whether they're allowed to play the game. And I learned this first when I was a student at Columbia University, and I was studying with a great African-American historian named Nathan I. Huggins, who used to say to me and to others that for minority groups in America, wars and sports are community-defining situations. If you're allowed to play for your club, for your city, for your home city, or fight for your country, it's a very important understanding of where you fit within the host society. Of course, for him, the moment in time was 1947, when Jackie Roosevelt Robinson's allowed to play the national pastime of baseball, 2 years before Harry S. Truman desegregates the armed forces. So that's important to understand whether Jews are allowed to play, how they're allowed to play, whether they're accepted in society. It says a lot about the nature of Jewish life in America. So that's point one. I'm interested in elevating the study of sports as an academic discipline, which is why I've written so much about the sports experience. Again, not about wins and losses, but whether you're allowed to play a game. And that leads me to Marty Glickman. The two gentlemen, of course, had their anecdotes about Marty Glickman and their experience with Glickman. But for me, the important thing is not so much about him as an announcer, although I'll regale you later on with some stories about Glickman as an announcer, but whether using the experience of a second-generation Jew who grows up in the 30s and 40s in New York, who aspires to make it in the American realm of sports and has difficulties in that endeavor, using Marty Glickman as a story to understand the marginality of Jews in America, and with particular reference to one moment in time, which has been chronicled and broadcasted, and that is his experience in the 1936 Berlin Games, Hitler's Games, where he's turned away in the last minute along with another Jewish runner named Sam Stoller and is unable to compete in front of 80,000 fans, including Adolf Hitler and all of his henchmen. So wars and sports define society, and whereas I could talk about many, many Jewish athletes, Glickman's story is a story about American Jewish history in the interwar and post-war period down to the present day. And I'll give you some examples as we go along of using Marty Glickman as a metaphor for understanding American Jewish experiences more than perhaps any other Jewish announcer or an athlete of his time period. And that's why I wrote about Marty Glickman. And finally, to get back to what you guys said at the outset, Marty Glickman was the voice of my youth. And my story is similar to the first David's story, is that at one point the Giants are playing a game on a Sunday afternoon, and the score is tied with a minute to go, and the Giants call timeout, and Marty Glickman says, if you're within the sound of my voice, open your windows of your tenements and your apartments and yell, go Giants, go, go Giants, go. So of course I go to the window, I open it up, I start screaming, and my father says, what in the world are you doing? I said, Marty Glickman told me to yell, no, go Giants, go Giants, go, so I did it. Now years later, there's a movie called Network, where Howard Beale opens the window and says, if you're within the sound of my voice, say, I'm mad as hell, I'm not going to take it anymore. Well, before that happened, Marty Glickman told me and millions of fans that listen to my voice. I tell you, yell, go Giants, go Giants, go. And you mentioned I'm an athlete. One other piece. When I played basketball in the schoolyard, if I made a basket, I'd go swish, because Marty Glickman said swish. Before Marv Albert said yes, and Marv Albert was his greatest disciple. Before Iron Eagle said bang, before other people used these statements, they all were disciples of Marty Glickman. So this is a long answer to a short question, but I love Marty Glickman. He's part of my life, and it intersects with my scholarship. And everything I do ultimately is going to intersect with my scholarship. This is great. They can only hear me.
Did it again. Marty Glickman would tell me never leave your audio off when you're narrating.
Right.
There's a lot in the book. It's a very rich book about American Jewish life. And besides the sports angle, there are lots of other things that you talk about Jewish life in the mid 20th century, American Jewish life. I just want to know if you can, relate some of that.
Well, the story begins in Brooklyn, in the Flatbush section of Brooklyn, in a Jewish neighborhood. It's a mixed ethnic neighborhood. Jews, Italians, Irish, Germans, no African Americans. It's a segregated city. He goes to James Madison High School, which is almost like a yeshiva. 75 to 80% of the students are Jewish. We often talk about the experiences of Jews in the interwar period, thinking about going to college. Can they go to college? What colleges would accept them? So I'm using Marty Glickman as a story. He's a great athlete. He's a great runner. He's a great football player. By the way, if you go to YouTube, you can watch a 20-second video of him playing football as a high school student. He ends up going to Syracuse University. Very interesting story. One is he's recruited by 14 different schools. Columbia wants him to go, notwithstanding their quotas against Jews. Why does he go to Syracuse? Because a group of Jewish fraternity brothers come down from Syracuse to convince him to go to Syracuse because they feel, believe it or not, that if a great Jewish athlete appears on the scene and brings glory to the orange men in Syracuse, that will help the status of other Jews within that university at a time where there are quotas against Jews. So he goes to Syracuse and he does quite well. He is, I know very little Latin, he's almost persona non grata honoris causa. He's honored because he's winning football games, he's winning track meets, but he doesn't change the status of Jews within the university. So you could use Glickman as a starting point for studying and understanding the nature of Jewish exclusion within the university world. Now he's on the football team, and he tells a story. He wrote 3 memoirs, which all 3 of them which I used. So he's at the training table, and he's not a kosher eater. He's a kosher style eater, which is very common for Jews of that time period. In fact, let me go back a step. He lives in a building with his grandparents. He tells us that the home was sort of kosher. They didn't have any tray meat, but they weren't that careful about kosher. If he wanted a real kosher meal, he'd go next door to his grandparents. People often write about Jews giving up their fidelity to strict kosher. Now I use Marty Glickman as a story. Anyway, he comes to the training table, and the entree for that meal is lamb chops. Except it's not lamb chops, it's pork chops. It's the first time he ever ate pork. Now, no one snuck the pork chops on his plate, but he wants to be part of the group. He wants to be accepted. And I have to note that there are a few African American athletes at Syracuse. They sit at a different table from Marty Glickman and all the white athletes. Do you see what I'm talking about? This is not about sports. This is about the life of a Jew trying to make it within the culture of America, breaking out of what I say in the book, the ethnic cocoon of Flatbush, and going to Syracuse with the hope of becoming a respected and honored athlete, which he is at Syracuse. And that leads us to 1936. Shall I talk about that, or we'll get to that later on, the signal moment at the Olympics? You're in charge, Coach. Where should we go from here? Shall I continue?
Up to you.
Okay. So he makes the American Olympic team, and he goes to Berlin. He gets to Berlin, and he's in the Olympic Village. When he gets to the village, he walks past Nazi guards who are protecting the athletes, and he knows a little bit of Yiddish, as David mentioned, and he talks Yiddish to these German officers, and he laughs at them. He makes fun of Hitler. He sits at the training table with everybody else. You understand, this is a period where Jews feel very marginal in American society, but he is living a charmed life. Everything is working for him. In fact, one day, he and a Jewish baseball player, now they had baseball at the 36 Olympics as an exhibition sport. And I saw an article about some 70,000 German fans came to the baseball game, and they were so bored by baseball that they walked out. Anyway, he and this other Jewish athlete hitch a ride to go to the Olympic Stadium. They hitch a ride with a lieutenant in the Luftwaffe, in the German Air Force. And the German officer, is so thrilled that he has these two American athletes in his car. When they get to the stadium, he asks Marty and this other Jewish athlete for their autographs. They're a little bit embarrassed because they're Jewish. They scribble their names and they run into the stadium. Ladies and gentlemen, up until now, everything is going great for Marty Glickman, notwithstanding the world around him. And then we get to the day before the Olympic event. He's supposed to be in the last event of the Olympic Games, a 4x100 meter relay race in front of 80,000 fans in the Olympic Stadium. A day before the race, in walks Avery Brundage. And I tell my younger people, Avery Brundage, Yamach Shemo. You'll see what I mean by that. Avery Brundage walks in and says, we heard a rumor that the Germans are hiding some great runners. So Marty, you're out. And Sam Stoller, the other Jewish sprinter, you're out. You're replaced by Ralph Metcalf and Jesse Owens. Community-defining situation. They're on the way out. Jesse Owens, to his credit, jumps up and says, wait a minute. I've got 3 gold medals already. I don't need a 4th. Let Marty run. And the coaches say, boy, sit down. That's how blacks are treated at that time period. So Marty and Sam Stoller never get a chance to run in the Olympic Games. Okay. Now I want to say one other thing. There's a movie out there called Race that chronicles the life of Jesse Owens. And they have the story all wrong. The way they tell the story, when Avery Brundage says, the Jews are not going to run, Jesse Owens says, I won't run either. And in the movie, Stoller and Glickman go to Jesse Owens and say, you must run to uphold America's role in the Olympics. And when they win the race, the movie shows that Stoller and Glickman run out of the stands, embrace Jesse Owens and say, USA, USA. It didn't happen that way. They were isolated. They were alone. and nobody cared. And one last thing for a moment, and then we'll talk about his post-Olympic experience. Why did I say Avery Brundage Yamach Shamo? Because Avery Brundage was the head of the American Olympic Committee in 1936, and he was an American Nazi, and he had business relationships with the Nazis. 36 years later, and it chagrins me terribly that when I talk about this to young people, they don't know it, but I know most of you do know that story. In 1972, Avery Brundage is not the head of the American Olympic Committee. He's the head of the International Olympic Committee, and 11 Israeli athletes are murdered by Palestinian terrorists. And at the they have 1 day of mourning for this murder. And Avery Brundage gets up and says the murdering of these athletes is part of the problems of the Olympics being commercialized by professional athletes. That's Avery Brundage. That's why Avery Brundage, in my mind, is one of the evil people of that time period. And you know what? It's not only anti-Semitism, because on vacation, I drive my wife nuts by reading nonfiction works. I read a long biography of Jim Thorpe, the great Native American athlete. In 1912, he wins gold medals at the Stockholm Games, and he's stripped of his medals because he's accused of making a couple of bucks playing semi-pro baseball. And who's involved in taking the medals away from Jim Thorpe? Avery Brundage. So keep that in mind. Community-defining situation. And this is a Jewish group. You understand that the Olympics have never been favorably disposed towards Jews and towards Medinat Yisrael down to the present day. So I hope you're hearing that what I have to say is not really about sports. It's about your position in society and whether you are accepted or not. A couple of Olympics ago, an Iranian athlete was given $40,000 by his country for refusing to wrestle against an Israeli. Sports, as Professor Huggins taught me, is a community-defining situation. And I have to say, 2 years, I believe, after Avery Brundage does this in 1972, another international organization that's not favorably disposed towards Jews and towards Israel, called the United Nations, defines Zionism as racism. So these are pieces of his life that are more important than his being a great athlete. And in fact, he was a great athlete.
Jeff, thank you. And let me turn now to Marty's inner life. I mean, this, I think, moves into that direction. When you were researching this book, I mean, so he lived a long life. In his long-term behavior and his mindset, what is it that you found the most striking thing about him as a person?
Well, there are two things. First of all, he was very reticent about criticizing America and speaking out about what happened to him in 1936. In fact, the Brooklyn Eagle, which was his hometown paper, interviewed Marty's father after the event. And Marty's father said, I wanted to speak out about what happened to my son, but my wife told me, don't speak out. It'll cause more problems for Jews than what happened to Marty. And Marty was always said, what happened to me was not Kristallnacht. It wasn't the invasion of Poland. Nobody died. But it troubled him tremendously that people were not interested in hearing his story. And I think it's a bit of a more controversial aspect of the book, that it took him a long time to understand that a new generation of Jews wanted to hear his story. In 1985, he goes back to Berlin. He goes back to the stadium. He goes back to the very stadium, and he looks at the stadium and he sees where Hitler stood, where Hitler sat. And he has this emotional response that he says, I must now tell my story to the world. And the U.S. Holocaust Museum picks up on this, And in the last years of his life, he died in 2001. He travels the country talking about his experiences as what he called a prequel to the Holocaust. So for me, Marty's behavior with reference to 1936, and when he begins to speak out, and when he begins to speak out much strongly, is another metaphor. It's a metaphor for when and how American Jews are willing to talk about anti-Semitism. Think of what his father says. I wanted to speak out, but my wife said, Shah, it won't look good for Jews. Marty had a similar attitude. He thought for the longest time that people were not interested in hearing his story. When he does speak out, people become very interested in his story. And again, he travels the country talking about his experiences and about anti-Semitism.
Okay, I think your answers to these three questions show very well that this is not exactly your run-of-the-mill sports book. It's actually a very deep analysis of what goes on for Jews, American Jews, and sports as a metaphor. But now I'm going to ask you a question then from the opposite direction. My first question was, why does a scholar talk about sports? Now I just want to ask you, what's in the book for a sports nut? I mean, for a sports fan in particular, what will the sports fan who's less interested in the deep themes want to get out of this book?
Well, again, Marty Glickman broadcasted in his career 2,000 games. He did Giant games. He did Knicks. He did college basketball. One of the things that troubled him the most is that in 1950, in 1950, my alma mater, which is not yeshiva, but City College of New York, wins the double championship. And then a year later, they get involved in the first basketball scandal about which others have written about. Marty Glickman was the announcer, and he writes in his memoirs how hurt he was that these boys who grew up in the same neighborhood, who he knew, who he interacted with, had betrayed City College, and that the reputation of New York Jews were so proud of the fact that they beat Kentucky, they beat Bradley, they won the double championship. They had got caught up with gamblers, and the reputation of Jews of New York was to some extent besmirched, and he feels very much betrayed. So that's one piece of the story. But again, if you went to the old garden, as I did as a kid, you heard the voice of Marty Glickman interviewing people. If you couldn't get a ticket, you listened to him on the radio. So it does chronicle sports, but I have to say that's the minimal part of the book. The maximal part of the book are the travails of Marty Glickman as he, tries to make it in America. And David, if you don't mind, I want to extend the story to the next aspect of his life. He comes back to America, and he has a dream to become a nationally recognized broadcaster. The two Davids and I, and imagine most of the people who are listening to me, remember Marty Glickman as the quintessential New York broadcaster. But his dream is to do national games. And he has a great difficulty getting the chance to make it in the world of broadcasting for two reasons. First of all, the people in the networks want him to change his name from Marty Glickman to Marty Manning, which he refuses to do. I will ask my audience if they ever heard of a person named Esau Danilowitz. That's Kirk Douglas. He's one of the people who changes his name to make it in Hollywood. Mel Allen Israel broadcasted the New York Yankees for many years. Marty Glickman refuses to change his name. And if you think this is a sports story or a man's story, remember that in 1947, a young Jewish woman, second generation Jew, living in one of the co-ops in the northwest corner of the Bronx, her name is Bess Meyerson, is pressured tremendously to change her name, and she refuses to do so because she says people won't know that a Jew became Miss America. So Marty Glickman has this problem. He won't change his name. His other problem is that, to some extent, he sounds like me. He's a New York Jew from Brooklyn, and he has a Brooklyn dialect. Now, David Hess was pleased that he said some things in Yiddish. That's great. I was pleased when he would say the Meshuggah scored a touchdown. As a New York Jew, we were very proud of the fact that, oh, listen, Marty Glickman was not an observant Jew, but he wouldn't broadcast on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, much like, other Jews had that issue as well. But he sounded like a New York Jew, and when he started broadcasting, and you know what, friends, maybe this is the saddest part of the story. When the National Basketball Association came into existence, its first year, it was known as the BAA, the Basketball Association of America. Marty Glickman wanted to be their broadcaster when they broadcasted nationally, but he's turned down, and he's turned down by two people. One is named Haskell Cohen, and the other one is Maurice Podoloff, two Jews who are founders of the BAA and the NBA, who felt that people didn't want a New York Jew with a Jewish voice and a Jewish name, how well it would play in Peoria. That is metaphorical for the lack of confidence Jews had during that time period, whether they be accepted in America during the time that he was moving up in the industry. You know what? One of the ironies of Glickman's life was, towards the end of his life, he's approached by NBC to teach broadcasting to young broadcasters, including athletes. By the way, the first woman to broadcast an NFL game, Gail Sirens, was one of the disciples of Marty Glickman. So he's hired to train athletes to be broadcasters. Bob Greasy comes to mind. Bill Walton comes to mind. Many others. In fact, I got a funny story to tell you. In doing this book, the most fun for me was to get in contact with the people who Marty Glickman influenced. In fact, there's a chapter called Marty as Mentor. And what I did was, if I somehow acquired an email address, I would send an email to this broadcaster who was formerly an athlete of somebody else. And I said, my name is Jeff Gurock. I'm a professor at Yeshiva. I have a contract for this book, and in big letters, and I'm not looking for any money. If you're interested in talking to me about Marty Glickman, please contact me as soon as possible. And if I don't hear from someone in a couple of days, I figure they're not interested. But everybody was interested. And the best interview was from Bill Walton. An hour after I sent an email, I get an email back from him saying, Jeff, I need to talk to you. So it takes a while for us to connect one with the other. Finally, we have this conversation. And Bill Walton, who was a great, great player for UCLA, and then Portland, and then the Celtics, says to me, this little guy, 5'8", was the most important man in my life. So I was taken aback. I said, hey, what about John Wooden, your great coach? He said, Glickman was more important because Glickman helped me deal with my stammering and stuttering problem as a kid and as a young adult. And he said, if you look at interviews after UCLA games, I never spoke. it was Glickman who taught me to be an announcer. So in 2001, when Glickman died, the LA Times interviewed John Wooden about Marty Glickman. And they asked him, what do you think of Glickman? And he said, he was okay, just okay. And Wooden says the following, and if you're laughing, I won't be able to see you laughing, but he says, well, Glickman taught Walton to speak, and now he never shuts up. So that was his take on that story. Another example, Sal Marciano. If you're an announcer, if you're a New Yorker, you heard Sal Marciano, another disciple of Marty Glickman, who I interviewed him, and I told him about Marty not changing his name. And Sal said, the same thing happened to me. I grew up in the Red Hook section of Brooklyn, and they wanted me to change my name, and I refused. And years after I made it in television, I ran into my childhood hero, who was Frank Sinatra. And Frank Sinatra said, I'm so proud you didn't change your name. So name change is something that scholars study. I'm studying it through the metaphor of Marty Glickman, and again, Sal Marciano, how immigrants and their children have to deal with lack of acceptance within America. So there's much more to this book. Again, thanks, David, for mentioning it, that it's not about sports. It's about a second generation American Jew trying to succeed within the United States.
And I think Mickey Mantle was originally Michael Mandelbaum. No, don't walk away thinking that that's true. I made
No,
that. Okay.
No, we never liked Mickey Mendel because
Yeah.
we sent him a birthday card and he never responded.
Oh.
But my brother and I sent a Refuah Shleima card to Herb Score in the 1950s when he was hit by a line drive by
Yeah. Right.
proud of. Even Gentiles who sound like Jews are people who Jews want to lionize. I think there was a story in Miami, the Miami Dolphins. They want to have a Jewish Heritage Night honoring some Jewish player who happened to be a Christian. So that's the search for Jewish heroes that continues down to this day. But again, it's not how many games you win; it's whether you're allowed to play. I reference this over and over again. And Professor Huggins is not around anymore, but I think he would be pleased that one of his students, who is in an African American class, took that metaphor and applied it to a different group. Although, look, the Black experience in America was far more problematic than the Jewish experience, but we can use the Jewish experience through Marty in a variety of different ways.
Okay. Here's my last question. You write a book. You spend a lot of years researching a particular person. You kind of see him up close in the level of theory. But did you ever connect to him personally? Now, if you were a medieval historian who had just written a book about Maimonides, I wouldn't ask you such a question. But over here, it seems to be really, really relevant. I think historians confront this very often. I'm not a historian, but I think the idea that you establish a personal relationship. What happened with the real physical relationship, Marty?
Well, you know what? This book is not a celebratory book, although the two Davids and I imagine most of the people who are still listening to this relate to Marty Glickman. But a few weeks before he died, the American Jewish Historical Society was going to honor him at one of their events. And since I'm considered in the AJHS their sports guy, they asked me to introduce Glickman. So that would have been the chance for me to meet Marty Glickman. Unfortunately, he didn't show up. And these poor people in the audience had to listen to me like you have to listen to me this evening. And a few weeks later, Marty Glickman passed away at age 2001 at age 83. So I think in a way, this is a bit of a tribute book. And a few months ago, I spoke at the AGHS about the book, and someone in the audience said, "How would Glickman want you to remember him?" And I think he wanted to be remembered not only as an athlete, as a broadcaster, but also as a teacher. And the fact that we're using Glickman, and the fact that in my syllabus on Jews in the interwar period has a small selection from my Glickman book to talk about Jews in Brooklyn, I think I would be pleased that I have this connection. And although I never met him, I feel I know him quite well. And he was so articulate in his 3 memoirs that I read that I feel very close to him, not only in terms of my history of him personally, but in terms of what I tried to do with his memory. And I hope he's remembered for all the things that he did.
Well, the book could recommend to everybody. The book is a wonderful tribute, and it has this, sort of undercurrent of the, or maybe even very explicit about the Jews, about Jewish life. There was one thing you mentioned in the book, very fleetingly, but I think it amused me. When Columbia University played against Syracuse, the Columbia quarterback was the famous later Hall of Famer Sid Luckman. And who is the quarterback for Syracuse? Glickman. Now, Glick in Yiddish is luck. So is the Yiddish Glickman versus the American Luckman.
Well, in high school, they played against each other, okay? It was Erasmus Hall against James Madison. And to tell you how big high school football was in New York, 20,000 fans attended the game in Ebbets Field of Blessed Memory, the home of the Brooklyn Dodgers. It was televised, not on TV, but newsreel all over the country. Glickman and his counterpart and Luckman against one another, and Columbia wanted both of them to come, but Glickman ended up going to Syracuse. Alan Doberman asked the question, what did Marty feel about the Jewish boycott of the Olympics? Which Olympics are you talking about? Could you write? I don't know, Jewish boycott of the Olympics. Excuse me. I'm sorry. I understand what you're asking.
You talk about it, yeah.
Okay, yes, okay. In 1936, it's a darn good question. 1936, before America decides to go to the Olympics, there's a great debate in America about whether America should go and participate in Hitler's games. And Jews are of 2 minds. Here we go again. There are Jews who are outspoken about the fact that America should not go. But there are so many other Jews who are concerned that if America does not go to the Olympics, it will look bad for Jews in America at that point. Again, another metaphor for the lack of confidence of Jews during the interwar period. And you know who speaks up against Avery Brundage back then? An Irish-American politician named Jeremiah T. Mahoney. And if you go to City College today, the gymnasium is named for Jeremiah T. Mahoney. So he is outspoken. There are some Jews who are, and Glickman, he's 17 years old. He's not politically astute. He so much wants to go to the Olympics that he doesn't join the boycott. That's not his consciousness. Now, there is a counter Olympics that is sponsored by the Jewish Labor Committee on Randall's Island for Jews who will not go to the Olympics. But here's the issue for Jews. Once America decides to go to the Olympics, do you stay home and say, I will not go to Berlin and participate in Hitler's games? Or do I go to Berlin and show the Nazis that their racial theories are all wrong and that Jews can be great athletes and could succeed? And I envision Marty Glickman when the American team marches in and the American team does not salute Hitler, He's very proud that America is standing up against the Nazis. But he has that moment in time when he's taken off the team, and he realizes at that moment, more than any other time, that he's a Jew. So that's a complexity of another complexity of his life. Absolutely.
Are there any other questions? You can put them on the chat and Jeff can field them.
At this point. Well, I hope you'll pick up the book. Hope you'll enjoy the book. And the many more details that I left out this evening that I'm sure will entertain you. And thank you, David, for your friendship and for reading the book and for saying some nice things about it. So
Yeah, it's a great story.
thank you.
Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you.
And there's a note from Sulamis. You can purchase Marty Glickman at NY with the code word. And for an autographed copy, email me and make the checks payable to Jeffrey Gurock. Did he ever? Oh, Keith asked, did he ever do national broadcasting? Yes, he did late in his career. And in fact, when he does the Rose Bowl in the 1980s, yes, does the Rose Bowl, how important that is. The announcers say he does a great job, but he does sound like a New Yorker after all. But, you know, that sort of dialect, I'm told it's a dialect, is much more accepted today than it was back then. And it's also projection about people in Peoria, whether they wanted to hear Marty Glickman or not. So he did some national broadcasting. Oh, one other thing. Towards the end of his life, Martin Glickman becomes Professor Martin Glickman at Fordham University. And every year at Fordham, they have an award for the outstanding broadcaster in training. It's called the Marty Glickman Award. So here he goes. He's a metaphor for Jews not being accepted at colleges and universities. At the end of his life, he is a broadcasting professor at a Catholic university in New York City. So he lived a very long, complicated life, which I was able to follow. And I mentioned before this session that if you're interested in hearing Marty Glickman's voice, usually the only person I promote is myself. There is a wonderful museum downtown in New York called the Paley, P-A-L-E-Y Museum of Broadcasting. They have thousands and thousands of tapes and recordings, including a number of tapes of Marty Glickman, so you can hear the great announcer up close and personal. So it's another connection to Marty Glickman.
I have to say that one thing that struck me about the book, I mean, as a professor, is how much of a science broadcasting is. I mean, you talk about the things that he taught broadcasters. He told them to read some poetry, right, to get their diction in shape and to warm up, and the choice of words. All of this was to me fascinating because they're all pedagogic techniques, and usually you just think that the broadcaster just gets on and talks, and there really is a science to it. And they all that's why they have such good voices also.
Well, apart from their voices, things like the keyhole, things like the sidelines, the terminology of basketball. When basketball was first broadcast in the 1940s, they would simply say, Smith passed it to Jones, passed it to Alexander, passed it to Sappin, passed it to Grunstein. It was Marty Glickman who gave you the words for broadcasting on the radio. And he said, for the most part, that he enjoyed doing a radio broadcast more than television. Because television, you had the picture and you had to do much more talking. He was also the first one to do a radio talk-in show. This was his connection to the Brooklyn Dodgers and to baseball. He didn't broadcast baseball, but he did pre- and post-game shows. And he said after he finished his evening, he'd walk out of the studio and there would be people waiting to ask him questions. So he was this commanding figure, and I think he really was the voice of the youth of an entire generation. And my core constituency of people like myself who are over 50 and who remembered Marty Glickman, and was Marty Glickman an influence on Bill Mazer? No, Bill Mazer was different. Actually, Bill Mazer came from a yeshiva background in Brooklyn. Uh, they were not connected. Uh, I remember Bill Mazer, by the way, speaking at a yeshiva university sports dinner. So he was very connected to our yeshiva, and he was a more traditional Jew. By the way, there's one other person who should be mentioned here, and that's another Jewish broadcaster named Howard Cosell, of the same generation. They didn't get along. Marty Glickman said that at the end of the day, the only person who really cares who's broadcasting is the broadcaster's mother. And he accused Cosell not only of changing his name from Cohen to Cosell, which isn't exactly true, but that was the allegation. But more importantly, Cosell felt that he was more important than the games themselves. Marty was a modest, humble man in that regard, and said, let the players be the story, not so much the broadcasters. There was one, by the way, there was one broadcaster in 1972 that Glickman really did not like. When this atrocity took place, Glickman was in the studio in New York doing half-hour reports on the Olympics. He was so angry that one of his disciples, named Chris Schenkel, described the end of the Olympics as a glorious meeting of athletes from all over the world. Just a few days after the Israeli athletes were murdered, they are talking about the grandeur of what known as the serene Olympics in Munich, which were not serene for the Jewish people. And this was a very impactful moment for him, for Glickman, as a Jew, when he again identified with his Jewishness. And again, in terms of his observance, he was a 3-day-a-year Jew, but he felt that just like his boyhood hero Hank Greenberg wouldn't play on Yom Kippur, he wouldn't broadcast on Yom Kippur. So that's other aspects of Glickman's life. Thank you for asking that.
Are there any other questions? If not, Jeff, I just want to wish you continued productivity. I hope there'll be a lot more biographies, a lot more analyses of American Jewish life at Me'av Yesrim. Really, thank you very much for doing this book and for everything else that you've done.
Thank you so much, David. You're a good friend and a great scholar, and also a good sports fan, and all those things are important. Wait a minute, Maurice Kleibar had a question. Did Marv Alpert, who succeeded Marty as the Knicks broadcaster, go to Syracuse because of Marty? Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, there's a whole tree of broadcasters who went to Syracuse, to the Newhouse School of Broadcasting, who saw themselves as disciples of Marty Glickman. Absolutely, including Gail Serens, this woman who is the first female broadcaster. Spencer Ross was one of these people. Bob Costas. I want to say a word about Bob Costas. I have a minute. Bob Costas did something after Glickman passed away that Marty would have been very pleased with, and it's a good way to end our story. When the Olympics were last in London, the London Jewish community and the Israeli team asked that the Olympics commemorate the murder of Israeli athletes, and the Olympic Committee refused. But however, when the Israeli team marched into the stadium, Bob Costas was the anchorman. As they walked in, he said, ladies and gentlemen, I want you to know who these people are and what happened to them. It was a 10-second tribute to the Israeli national team. And then the NBC went to a commercial. It says a lot about Costas. And I think somewhere Marty Glickman was smiling because one of his disciples, who was not a Jew, came up big in terms of understanding what sports means to Jews and what acceptance means to Jews. All these things are part of Marty Glickman's legacy. So I think Marty Glickman would be very pleased with Bob Costas, who is one of the people that I spoke with when I did this book. Okay. Well, thank you very much for phoning in and coming in, and I hope you enjoyed this book. And thank you, David, for taking from your valuable time to spend some time with us. And thanks to the Hess family for inviting me to speak here at Yeshiva.
My pleasure.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And once again, details about purchasing the book are in the chat, which includes how to get an autographed copy. These details will also be shared in an email to all those who registered for this event. Have a good night.